Welcome to another interview in our FM Expert series. Today I'm joined by David Smith. Hi, David.
Hi, Beth.
Good to see you. Thanks for joining us. David is a director and consultant at Datara Management Solutions, who are an FM Consultancy. And David, you are a pretty experienced compliance auditor as part of one of the services you offer. So what David's going to do with us today is he's going to talk us through some of the common issues he comes across when he does compliance audits. And I hate to think how many you've done, but these are going to be the common themes. And I think, to be honest, we're all going to learn something from this. So David, thank you for joining us, and I'm going to hand over to you.
Hi, Beth, again. Thanks for inviting me today.
My pleasure.
I'm going to build a little bit on some of the expert interviews that you've already undertaken, particularly perhaps Greg Markham's one, where he talks about compliance in the healthcare sector. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about compliance from a pragmatic viewpoint and some of the things that I've seen over the years.
Yeah, fantastic.
Okay, and hopefully there'll be some takeaways as well that will help the audience move forward. There we go. There are 6 topics, looking down my list, that I commonly see over the years.
Well, and then let's have them. What's the first one?
Well, in no particular order, fire dampers.
Okay.
Fire dampers are dampers within ductwork systems that stop air coming into the building and fueling a fire, in simplistic terms.
Yeah.
They're controlled by actuators, and the actuators are linked back to the fire system and controlled by the fire system. In older times and older buildings, sometimes you would have a thermal fuse that would control those, which effectively is some solder that would just melt, and then the damper themselves would spring load into the closed position. Nowadays, they're normally controlled by a motor that's powered from the fire alarm.
Okay.
So in that topic, one of the things that I often see is that there isn't a plan of where the fire dampers are.
There isn't a plan.
There isn't a plan.
Okay. Yeah.
Or if there is a plan, it's not very reliable, but mainly there isn't a plan. And there is some understanding for that. Fire dampers aren't the easiest of things to spot. They're up high in ceilings often. They're covered in insulation. They're not easy to see. And they're a real difficult thing to generally trace and put in place if you haven't got them from the building from day one.
Yeah.
The second thing about fire dampers is, as a part of testing the devices on the fire alarm, which you need to do 100% per year, you need to know that not only is that fire alarm sending a signal to that actuator to open that fire damper, but that it's actually connected to the fire damper and just not hanging in mid-air and moving its spindle but not attached to anything.
Yeah.
And that's something that we've seen quite a lot of.
Okay, I think that's a brilliant tip, and I think you're right. I think it's something that is often overlooked. So thank you for that. That's fantastic. What's one of the second things you see most commonly?
Emergency lighting.
Okay, what's the issue with emergency lighting?
2 things really. So the emergency lighting consists of a discharge test, which happens annually, and then also monthly illumination tests. And I think the thing that I normally see is the tests are carried out, but there is a lack of consistency. So often I see situations where, perhaps more on a mobile site than on a manned site, a mobile technician does a test 1 month, identifies a number of failures, reports those to be fixed, and they don't necessarily get fixed by the time that the next test is undertaken. And a different technician does the test at the next month, and he may flag up no faults with those that his colleague previously identified, but faults elsewhere. And you seem to get into this circle where faults never are documented to be pinned down and resolved. So short of going around the building and checking those lights have been replaced and are working, you can never have 100% confidence that that is the case.
So this is a management issue rather than the engineers not doing it right. It's something closing the loop on it, isn't it?
It's closing the loop, and it seems to be one that forever you are chasing, go round and round the circle. Quite often the annual discharge test will cover off a lot of that, but then you get into a situation where how long is it reasonable to actually put right and remediate that fault?
Yeah.
From experience, if we take some of the risk associated software such as RiskWise, it allows you to put in a duration for fixing that fault. But maybe being slightly cynical, if you put 60 days on remediating a task, or 90 days or 30 days, generally it won't gain any focus until the last 10 days. So you might as well nearly to some extent shorten the duration to attend to the fault, in the knowledge that it'll only happen towards the end as it is.
Yeah, get it done. Okay,
yeah, so
brilliant.
Let's get on with it.
What's number 3?
The next one, and again, they're in no particular order or severity, is thermostatic mixing valves and their temperatures.
All right, commonly known as TMVs.
Commonly known as TMVs.
Okay.
Depending on what building you're operating as to whether you have a lot of them or not many of them at all. Clearly what a TMV does is mixes a blend of hot and cold water to give you a temperature of 43.2 degrees C. But what you need to know to be really compliant is the temperature of the cold water that's feeding into the blend of that mixing valve, and also the hot water, the temperature of that. In the best installations, there are normally pockets where you can take a sample from to be able to get that temperature. And some of the things that we do see are people using infrared sensors or a sensing device to measure the temperature, whereas it needs to be done properly.
Okay. So the issue is the cold and the hot aren't both being tested, or? Yes,
and some technicians will believe that they need to measure the blend and not actually the individual temperature as well as the blend.
So that's the thing to look out for. Brilliant. Thanks for that, David. Okay, fantastic. Number 4.
Okay, number 4. One that is a bit of a hot potato, which is the electrical inspection condition report.
Okay.
And there are various ways in which you can undertake this test. You can do 100% of testing of circuits every 5 years, or you can do a percentage per year, and you can break it down pretty much however you want to break it down. So a third every 20% per annum is another approach. And there are various strategies about doing that, depending perhaps on the longevity of how long you're going to be in the building for.
And what do you see as some of the issues around that?
Well, the issues that I normally see are when you do electrical inspection condition report, you get defects if you have some, which are classified as C1, C2s, and C3s. And I don't really have an exception with those. If they're there, they normally get done. Certainly the C1 and the C2s. C3s aren't so important. But perhaps most importantly is the parameter that is set to undertake that test. I've seen examples of parameters where the testing excludes anything behind closed panels, anything below floors, and anything above ceilings. And with the majority of electrics being above a ceiling, this doesn't make a lot of sense, and I think in the event of an issue would be considered a non-compliance. So there is a need to understand when your service provider is undertaking, or their specialist is undertaking an electrical inspection condition report, that you've all agreed on the parameters.
And that the parameters are good enough.
And that the parameters are good enough, and that maybe your service provider doesn't suggest something that you go along with because perhaps you don't fully understand. So be clear that those parameters are meaningful and worthwhile doing. Otherwise, you might all be wasting your time.
I think that's a really, really important one. Thank you. Okay, what's the 5th most frustrating or common thing you find in your compliance audits?
Well, so for some clients, we audit and review their sites where they perhaps own a multi-let property.
Yeah.
And they have got a number of tenants that employ more than 5 employees.
Yeah.
And when you get to 5 or more employees, then there are requirements to have fire risk assessment and in their own demise to have their own testing done. And it is quite difficult to get if you're supporting and working for the building owner or the operator or perhaps acting on behalf of the managing agent, to be able to get multiple let tenant buildings documentation, because you get into that difficult area where where the owner of the building or the manager of the building doesn't want to upset the tenants too much, but still needs the paperwork and the documentation to know that they themselves are compliant and not putting the other tenants at risk.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that perhaps one of the takeaways is perhaps to get you, if you're in a multi-let building, to make sure that your fellow tenants are also compliant and not just you. Yeah,
brilliant. That's a really important one. Thank you. Okay. Did you have anything else for us in terms of your common themes?
Well, then the last one, and I've been back and checked for a little bit of the records and things that we've got. Another one we sometimes see, not so much, but are on fire systems where maybe the fire system is a closed protocol system, and the fire maintenance company that is undertaking the maintenance is not doesn't have access to that closed system. Maybe they're locked out of it. Increasingly, what we're seeing is some globalization of companies that provide fire systems, BMS systems, and the like, and they're increasingly locking in protocols to stop lower charging companies from being able to access the systems completely and be able to interrogate the system. So quite often they will have some access, but perhaps not full access,
and not enough
limits
access.
what they can do.
Yeah. Okay. All right. That's something people can look into. So, being conscious of time, we're at about 12, getting on for 12 minutes. So, give us a final few tips that people can take away, because this is brilliant so far.
Okay. So, the takeaways that I've got here are again in no particular order. Okay. Do a walk around of all of your building. You know, it's lovely walking around the nice glossy parts, but you need to go behind the scenes sometimes and have a look at some of the plant rooms and some of the less areas. You don't have to do them every week. You don't have to do them all of the time, but maybe just take out some time once in a while and walk around those less prominent areas. And if there's something that you don't like or you don't see or causes you to think about it, then ask your maintenance service provider some questions about it. You are, after all, employing them, and they are there to deliver a service for you.
Yeah, and that was a brilliant tip. Sounds so obvious, doesn't it? But I don't think people do it because everyone's busy.
They don't have time. Okay. The second one I've got here is have your maintenance service provider talk through the maintenance that they do. Perhaps do that a topic at a time. Maybe emergency lighting. You could ask the technician, if it's on a manned site, or the contract manager, just to go and bring you the records for the last 15 months, say, of the emergency lighting, and just talk you through what's happened over that 15 months and just make sure. And maybe in him doing that with you, or her in doing that with you, it might throw up a few areas that might need a bit of focus, or it might give you the confidence that everything is and reassurance that everything is in good order. And
before you move on to the next one, I'm going to add to that. I always say to people, when engineers, for example, come in to do activities, whether it's something like an annual fire extinguisher service, watch them. You know, I don't mean the whole team stand there watching them for the whole time, but actually just ask questions and understand why they're doing what they're doing, because we don't use these people as experts and we're missing a trick, aren't we? So yeah, I think that's a fantastic tip, David. Thank you for that. Okay. Any more?
All right. Yep. So there's I think there's 3 more. Obviously, from time to time, for whatever reason, we all change out our service provider and bring in a new service provider. Yeah. If you're changing out the service provider, and it can't always be easy because of the timings and everything else, do make sure that during the last, ideally 6 months, the documentation that service provider is providing for the maintenance that they've undertaken is fully up to date and is wholesome and correct.
Yeah.
Okay. Because the last thing you want to do is be saying goodbye to one service provider and welcoming in a new service provider, only for that new service provider to turn around and say to you, oh well, the last company didn't provide X,
yeah.
Y, Z, and we've now got to redo it. Perhaps even
go on, I interrupted you. Go on, sorry.
Perhaps even consider asking the new service provider as part of their mobilisation to undertake some due diligence on the documentation that they're being provided with, to make sure it is complete, wholesome and fully up to date, and any outstanding remedials completed. Your outgoing service provider will have their specialists that may have some actions to do, and it's likely that the new service provider will have their own specialists, but not the same ones. And if you're not careful, you'll get to a situation where you double pay.
Yeah, and also I think in the specification, you should also plan for the end of the contract, because it's not something to be embarrassed about. Contracts end,
Yeah.
So it should be written in how that process is going to be managed at the beginning, because it's, it's planning, isn't it? Okay, any more?
Really, just two short ones more, which is, remember, really, as we've just said, you own the data, you've paid for the maintenance, the documentation is a key part of that maintenance service provision. Without the documentation, you might just as well not do the maintenance.
Yeah.
Because if you end up in a situation where you have to demonstrate what you've done, if you haven't got the documentation, you can't demonstrate it.
Yeah.
So A, do that. And B, if you don't understand the documentation, then ask.
Yeah.
We employ service providers for their expertise and their professionalism. They should have the answers. And if they don't have the answers, then I guess
you've got more questions.
You've got more questions. Yes.
Brilliant. Is that you done?
I think it is. Yes.
David, that is absolutely fantastic. And we're at about 17 minutes, but I tell you what, that is 17 minutes of quality info. And I think it's going to be really, really useful. I bet we get requests saying, can you do another one to give us some of the other things? Because you've given us 6 key things to look out for, but also some really useful tips. So listen, that was brilliant. Thank you very much for your time. I very much appreciate it, and your expertise. I will put a link on when I post this on LinkedIn and on YouTube, how people can get hold of you if they're interested in compliance audits, because I think it's something that we should probably all be looking at. So David, thank you for now. Thank you for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Beth.
Okay.
Really enjoyed it. All the best.